Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. There's lots of new faces in the crowd, but a few, particularly around this area, that I recognise. So yeah, hopefully you all understand that after 2 years of not having stood up and done one of these things, we're all a bit rusty. But yeah, hopefully what you'll get out of this talk is one or two things where you're like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that was happening in .NET. And that's what I hope to do for you this evening, is just to plant those little seeds, and you can go away and investigate. Maybe it's something that's coming up as we get towards the end of the talk. I'll be talking about stuff that's coming down the track, or maybe it's something that's been around since this user group unfortunately had to cease operations for those 2 years. First of all, I'd like to say I'm from Telstra Purple. This is our office. So thanks Telstra Purple for letting us use the Telstra Purple event space here. We love having events in our event space because it's a great space. We think it's pretty good. The other thing to know about Telstra Purple is if you're a software dev and you're not happy where you are, you might be happy with us. So there's lots of roles available. We've got lots and lots of work and not enough people to do it. So and we've got lots of people who'd like us to do work for them, but we have to say no. So if you'd like to come on board, get a good staff deal on some telecommunications, and a lot of great stuff. Telstra Purple does a lot of partnering with Microsoft and Apple and AWS and all those providers. So, and Microsoft as well, of course. Should mention them since we're at the .NET User Group. So yeah, if you head to purple.telstra.com, you'll be able to find the careers and click away on that. But yeah, thanks to Telstra Purple for the space and also for the pizza tonight. So yes, unfortunately the .NET User Group has been away. We had a couple of great talks last month, but before that, you'll notice the meetup page, there's a bit of a gap. So let's just do a little bit of time travel. Let's go back to January 2020. I'm sure everyone here can remember January 2020. I wasn't here to hear John Bristow talk, but he's a great presenter, so I'm sure it was a really good talk. Todd's nodding enthusiastically. I'm getting a double thumbs up even, which isn't unusual. Todd's an enthusiastic guy. But yeah, but John is a really good presenter, so I'm sure that went off great. And I'm sure that Emily and Loren's talk in March was going to go fantastically, because I happen to know that they're both great people. But unfortunately, that happened. And yeah, so you'll notice that over on the other side of the screen there, it might be a little small, but 7th of July was 2022 was the next talk. So that's a gap of 2 years, 5 months, and 15 days. And yeah, I would have gone out and calculated the hours and minutes as well, but I wasn't sure exactly when John's talk finished. And yeah, anyway, but that's a big gap. Now, I happen to know that even when .NET user groups were running regularly, I recall giving a talk here a couple of years ago where I mentioned a feature of C#, and I got a lot of puzzled looks from the audience. And I was like, oh, this isn't what I'm talking about, but who's heard of this feature? And not many people put their hand up. So I had to take a bit of a detour, because the feature I was going to talk about was, this is now improved. But a lot of people there, you know, they're not working on code bases that are necessarily have any reason to move off .NET Framework, so they're not seeing the new C# features. So my idea for this talk was just to cover a whole list of things that you might have missed while we were away. And the way I thought I'd cover this is to give you some quick outlines, like starter notes that I might have started writing down if I was going to present a talk. And this is an imaginary timeline of talks. These talks possibly wouldn't have happened. everyone in the .NET User Group community probably would have got really sick of me standing up every couple of months and talking about stuff. But we've got this imaginary timeline of talks. So we're going to go on a little bit of a time travel. We're going to time travel all the way back to June 2020. And let's forget about what June 2020 was actually like for everyone. Let's say that it was all happy days and that we were coming in on the 16th. We were coming into this space and we were going to hear a talk. And we're going to hear a talk by me. These talks are all by me, just because it was easier than trying to work out who would have given these talks. I definitely would have given this talk. So this is Blazor lights up the browser. So we're giving this talk at the Brisbane .NET User Group. And the reason that I'm giving this talk in June is because just the month before, Blazor WebAssembly was officially released. So is anyone sitting there going, what is Blazor? What is he talking about? Yeah, we get a couple of here. All right. So Blazor is a framework for building interactive client-side web-based user interfaces with .NET. Actually, I said web-based there. Kind of wrong. It's kind of just for building user interfaces. So it's based on C# and the Razor syntax. So if you think MVC, where you're building your views, yeah, what if they could be little components that ran in your web page instead of running on the server and just producing HTML? So it is a component-based architecture, so think more Angular than React. And it comes in two variants. One is called Blazor Server, and one is called Blazor WebAssembly. And the WebAssembly part is the new part. All right, so what does Blazor Server mean? So Blazor Server was released with .NET Core 3.1. Now, what it did was it took these components that were built out of Razor and .NET Core code and .NET assemblies, and it ran them on the server. And the reason it ran them on the server was Microsoft has a very good, very fast runtime for running .NET on the server. It's kind of their bread and butter, what they've been doing for many, many years. And then they set up a SignalR connection to your browser, and they have a little JavaScript shim. And then what they do is they send a whole heap of instructions. They basically serialize the output of your components, serialize them down to your browser, and up it pops. Renders it out. And then somebody may fill in a form and click the button, and all the changes that are happening on the web page are all hooked into this JavaScript layer, sent back over the SignalR, and there's a very efficient, very detailed protocol that I understood once after there was a presentation done by one of the people who worked on it. But yeah, I've forgotten now. But let me assure you that it's all really good. So what are the benefits of this model? Well, you're running on the server. So if you've ever wanted to, when did I last see this commonly happening? Maybe with the classic ASP days. If you ever wanted to, in your web page, just write a SQL query and just connect straight to that SQL server, theoretically you can with Blazor Server. Why? Because you're not running in the web page, you're running on the server. So it makes things very simple for you to connect to services. There's essentially no API that you need to worry about because it's all shoveled over that SignalR connection. What are the downsides? Well, now all your users aren't running out on their browsers. All your users are running on your server all the time. So they need to be connected to that same server. They also need to be connected, they also need to be running there all the time. So they're taking up resources. So it doesn't scale as well. So does it scale? To a degree. Does it scale well? No. So if you're building a super high traffic website, if you're building Amazon, you're not going to use this. However, if you're building a smaller web application, maybe an admin website for the back end of some product that's only going to have the 50 users who work for that company connecting, it's a great option. Now, the reason they went with Blazor Server was actually what I mentioned about there being a solid .NET runtime. Because Blazor WebAssembly basically takes all that .NET and ships the .NET down to the browser and runs it there. So you take your C#, you take your Razor, and you build them into a DLL, and then you take that DLL and you run it in the browser. What? So what they've done is, so WebAssembly is a browser standard. It's a browser standard for running code. So there are compilers from Rust and Python and Ruby and C, and you name a language. There's a compiler somewhere that will compile to WebAssembly, and it'll run in the browser. So a guy named Steve Sanderson at Microsoft went, there's this .NET runtime called Mono that is really good at running on different platforms. Maybe I could compile enough of Mono to WebAssembly to get .NET to run in the browser as well. So he tried it, and it was just a fun activity for him, and he sort of presented it at an NDC, and everyone went, yes, that, we want that. Because what it does allows you to do is it allows you to write your whole UI in only C# and not worry too much about JavaScript. Maybe you need a little JavaScript for a little shim here and there, but you can just write C# code. So as a .NET developer, I love this idea. Haven't had the opportunity to build an actual product with it. Just been doing stuff, little stuff on my own, but it's great. So this is what was shipping in 2020. It was delayed a bit because they were having trouble with that Mono on WebAssembly bit, getting that to the stability that they thought was supported. But yeah, May 2020, this became a fully supported product. So fast forward a couple of years. We're a couple of years in the future. We're time travelers here. We've got some foreknowledge. What becomes of these? Well, they're still around. They're still shipping improvements. They're shipping controls. Not only Microsoft, but there's open source controls. I'm sure you all love a good data grid. There's data grids galore. There's lots of things that you can essentially pull in and make your app look great. There's controls that will integrate with a lot of the CSS templates that so you might be using Bootstrap or one of the other templates. All great. You can now hit like F5 and you can have a breakpoint set in your C# code in Visual Studio or VS Code, and it can stop in your browser where the breakpoint is, and you can step through C# code in your browser. I suggest you try that at least once, just to really feel weird watching your C# step in your browser. That's good. And they've expanded. This is why the web-based that I had in the other slide I probably shouldn't have had. Blazor Hybrid is about building in mobile apps or building on the desktop. So, we've got something that renders HTML on the desktop. There's really quick ways of embedding a HTML viewer. And on the desktop, there's also really good ways of running .NET. So you can write yourself a little PWA, bit like Electron, maybe, that just runs your .NET code, and Blazor Hybrid is there to do it. You can plug in a little box in Windows Forms. So perhaps you've built a really great chart control in Blazor that you use in the company website. You can have it in your Windows Forms in a little window. And .NET MAUI, which I'll mention again later on, but it's the new mobile framework, has Blazor bindings as well. And the last thing there, WASI, which it stands for WebAssembly System Interface. So WebAssembly System Interface is a standardized way of accessing an underlying system from WebAssembly. Because normally WebAssembly running in the browser, it's a bit like JavaScript, it's very locked down. So this this WASI is essentially like, what if we could take WebAssembly out of the browser and run it elsewhere? Why? Well, because people on the internet are a little crazy, but it leads to some really cool things. So what you can do then, with the help of Blazor, the Blazor runtime, is you can start running .NET wherever WASI things can run. All right. So obviously I would have gone into more detail in my talk about all that. I'm sure there's a few people here saying, no, go into more detail now. Unfortunately, we need to hop back in our time machine and get time traveling, because I don't want to keep you here till midnight by delivering 4 or 5 talks in full. I'm probably already running way over. Jump forward to 17th of November. As someone born in the 80s, I had to go with that title. .NET 5 is alive. All right. As I've said, I'm also giving this talk. So .NET 5, I'm sure you've all heard about that. And I'm sure the first thing you heard when you heard Microsoft was releasing .NET 5 to follow up .NET Core 3.1, you were asking 2 things. What happened to number 4? And what happened to the word core? During .NET 5's development, I think, I can't prove this, well, I think it has been said places, they noticed they had .NET Framework 4.8, which is the currently supported the most recent .NET Framework on Windows, and they were about to release .NET Core 4. You can see how that could get confusing, especially for people who aren't, perhaps in the development space. Probably everyone in this room would have tracked it fine, or most people would, but if you're talking to a system administrator who just wants to get the right stuff installed on that server image for your new project, that could lead to confusion. And the other thing that they decided to do was combine. So at the start of .NET 5 development, they had .NET Core, they had Xamarin, they had Mono, they had lots of different .NETs, basically, that Microsoft all owned. And the trouble was they'd do an performance improvement over here, and it wouldn't flow to everything because they were all separate. So what they wanted to do is to build one .NET. So they decided to get rid of the core to communicate that it was something slightly different. But it was mostly based on the .NET Core codebase, but it's designed to be the successor to both .NET Framework, .NET Core, Xamarin, and Mono all together. So in modern times, when you run up a Xamarin app, it's no longer running Mono underneath. It's now running the .NET 5 or .NET 6 framework. They also simplified the whole Net Core app and Net Standard and all that stuff. Basically now, .NET 5 is Net 5.0. If you want to access something that's Windows specific, you can add Net 5.0-Windows, and a whole heap of Windows APIs will light up for you. And one of the big features with .NET 5 was actually extra platform-specific checks that you could mark a method as, hey, this is a Windows method, or hey, this is a Linux method, so that you get a compiler error when you tried to use it on the wrong target. Now, one of the big drivers for that was actually the topic of our talk the other month, Blazor, because in the browser there's a whole heap of stuff that doesn't necessarily work. Now, Net Standard 2.1, which came out with .NET Core 3.1, you can see how that gets confusing. Net Standard 2.1 is still supported. .NET 5 implements it fully. Net Standard 2, which is shared with .NET Framework, that's still implemented fully. So if you do a library for Net Standard 2, it'll still work on all this stuff. It's designed to be less confusing rather than more, but explaining it can sometimes make it sound confusing. So another big thing that that they announced was full support for ARM64, and something that I didn't realize came back this far was top-level statements. Does anyone know? Has anyone seen that as of .NET 5, the standard console.writeline hello world sample is now literally one line. A .cs file called program.cs that is simply system.console.writeline hello world. That's all you need, because .NET will wrap the rest of a program CS automatically for you around that. So what that means is your program CS can be really simplified. And it takes out a couple of layers of nesting, because you'd have the namespace, then you'd have the program, and then you'd have the method, and then you'd have your actual code where 4 levels down there. No, all the way up the top. So now those really long lines you had in your program CS file, you can see more of them. But yeah, I just didn't realize top-level statements in .NET 5. .NET 5 also brought us C# 9. So C# 9 came with init-only properties. So you can basically say, you can only set this property when I'm initializing. So either in a constructor or when you're in an init block. So if you've got the curly braces straight after. After that, no. Interesting thing about that means, because you're still technically in this constructor, you can set read-only properties behind those init properties. So that's pretty cool. After that, they function like a getter. Trying to assign a value is a compile error. And what they did was they took init-only properties and they wrapped it up in some syntactic sugar, and they gave you record types. A record type is a special type of class that the compiler will blow out an implementation for that includes stuff like essentially value equality. So if you make a public record person with first name Joe, last name Blogs, and you make a second type with the same Joe Blogs, they will be equal if you just use the equals sign, which is great. It's nice. That's how some of this stuff should work. You don't need to write all that I equatable of this and override equals, and no, it's all done for you. Also, positional deconstruction. If you want to split out the first name and last name into variables, you can wrap in the brackets first name, last name variable equals your person, and it'll pull those out. So record types are pretty cool. I don't know. I tend to throw them in. They're really great for DTOs. So if you're doing a little DTO that you want to, or a intermediate result, instead of returning a tuple, although you've got the fancy named tuples now, yeah, record types are great for that. We also got ASP.NET Core 5. It's got a whole heap of improvements. It also got built-in support for OpenAPI and Swagger UI. So if you go File, New Project in .NET 5 or above, and hit F5 on a Web API project, you'll get Swagger UI, which is a lot more helpful than just an error page saying, yeah, there's nothing here. Yep.
Did they have core in that? If they had .NET 5, why don't they just got ASP.NET 5?
Well, because ASP.NET is a .NET framework library, and you have ASP.NET MVC5 was a released thing. So there's confusion there as well. So ASP.NET and Entity Framework kept the core branding to separate them, because they still have libraries, their old version of their libraries. So the Entity Framework 6, although it's in maintenance, it's not really, yeah. So that's why they kept core for ASP.NET. And performance improvements. So if you go out and if you're following the right people on Twitter, which I seem to be, you get a lot of graphs of, squiggly line, lower squiggly line, and they're like, pick when we upgraded to .NET 5. That's what we were seeing. So yeah, for free, you just upgrade from .NET Core 3.1 and you get better performance for free. It won't solve your performance issues. Your performance issues are your own, but it will make them slightly less issuey. All right, let's jump back in the time machine because I don't think that last bit really worked. Let's jump a whole year. It's not because nothing interesting happened there. It's just that there's only so much time in this talk. And who would have guessed it? After a year, .NET 6 and C# 10. So you may have noticed a pattern here. It's November, and we're talking about .NET 6, and it's a year after November where we talked about .NET 5. So this is the release cadence that Microsoft is on now. November, every year you get a release. Now, .NET 6, it had more performance as well. Surprise, surprise. .NET 6 is also what they call a long-term support release. The previous one was .NET Core 3.1. So for .NET Core 2 and 3, they would release the 0.0 version, and then they would release a stabilization release that would become the long-term servicing one. They're just doing the stabilization before they release the whole song and dance. So it'll have support for about 3 years. It's got a heap of HTTP3 goodness sprinkled all through it, both from the client. So a HTTP client speaks HTTP3 as of November 2021, and the server side does as well. So that's great moving forward. What the release of .NET 6 means, though, is .NET 5's days are numbered. Now, being time travelers, we already know that .NET 5 end of support has already happened. So if you're wandering around your organization and you notice that somebody's still requiring .NET 5 to build an app, you should really go to .NET 6. And .NET Core 3.1, the previous long-term support, will end in the future, even for us. So what was actually in .NET 6? Well, just like .NET 5, there was a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to go through absolutely all of it. But I do have some really fun features that I really enjoy using in C# 10. So C# 10 introduces global using directives. So basically, you can have a C# file called usings, or called anything actually, just a C# file. You can say global using my namespace. Suddenly, every C# file in that project will have my namespace as one of its usings, even though you won't see it. So that's kind of cool. The place I find this most useful is unit test projects. You know, when you spin up a new C# file for a unit test, and the first thing you do is you like open bracket test or open bracket fact or whatever for the attribute. And suddenly it's red squiggly and you're like, oh, that's right, I forgot to bring in my test library's namespace. Not anymore. Global using, right at the top. Global using NUnit, global using XUnit, global using NSubstitute, your approval library, whatever you need to reference. Really great in unit test projects. I find it slightly less useful in normal projects because normally you don't want to globally blat your namespaces around. For your namespaces, for namespaces in the SDK, think system. You almost always have system up there. What's it doing there? It should just be there. It can be with a feature called implicit usings. So this is a feature you turn on in your project file. You say implicit usings true, and suddenly a list of predefined list of using statements from the SDKs you're referencing will magically appear. So things like system or ASP.NET Core dot various things. There's long lists. It's great. Another thing up there, file scoped namespaces. Oh, this is fantastic. I see some applause in the audience. Good man. Yes. File scope namespaces, basically you say namespace, your namespace at the top of the file, still all normal so far. No open brackets, no, we don't need that level of indentation. The rest of your file is just in that namespace. You just put a semicolon at the end. These days, in my .NET 6 projects, the first thing I do when I come into a file that I haven't touched in a while, it's like, put the semicolon at the end, everything just moves to the left a little bit. It's great. Record structs. So we saw records in .NET 5. This is records but structs. So this is now really close to being a tuple. Record structs actually have mutable members by default. So they're almost like tuples. So in our last thing, we had the first name and last name. They would have been immutable. You wouldn't have been able to change them. You would have needed to use a with statement, which creates a copy and updates with the values that you give. Record structs, they're mutable. So you can use them essentially like tuples, but with typing. So that's cool. And they're structs, so they're pretty lightweight. You can add a read-only if you want it to act like the record types with the immutability. And there's a heap of interpolated string improvements, including interpolated strings that only contain constants. So this is where you've got the $sign, you open up the little holes with the curly braces. If you only put constants in there, maybe a name of, maybe whatever, as long as it's constants, the whole interpolated string will be a constant as well. So why is that handy? Well, I mean, you can declare it as a const string and use it somewhere. That's cool. But parameters to attributes have to be constant. So that allows you to build up an interpolated string of parameters for an attribute that you couldn't do before. All right. It wouldn't be a talk by me if I didn't mention dates and times and date time zones. And we got 2 new types. This is exciting. So, have you ever been carrying around a date time and had things go wrong because somewhere somebody treated it like a date time instead of, just the date that it was meant to be? And you're like, no, there's no time there. I set it to 0 for a reason. You now have a date-only type, which contains a date only. Now, who wants to ask why the only? So there was long GitHub discussions about this, about the naming. They went through many names, and they did much compatibility testing. And yes, there was much argument backwards and forwards, and this was the best they came up with that wouldn't break everything. Because can you imagine how many things that would break if suddenly just date was a type name? All those properties that were currently, date time date of the event or whatever. It's just date. Suddenly that's a type, and you need to put the little @ symbol there.
It's not only the keyboard, can't you still do it for time?
Maybe, but you'd have clashes. There would be clashes.
This is also very explicit, right? Like it's annoyingly explicit in a good way.
Yeah.
This is a date only. This is a time only.
It's a date only. It's look, yeah. It's
What's it going to be like? Also something else.
Now let me just say that during the announcement, for any of you out there who are fans of Noda Time, which I'm literally getting some excitement and hands up in the audience. They did actually look at whether it was worthwhile to just bring Noda Time into the framework. That would be huge amount of effort, and I think some people would be surprised at how small the .NET team is. Like we could. I don't know the latest counts, but you're talking numbers comparable to the number of people in this room. You're talking really small numbers considering when you think there's hundreds of people, but there's not. There's really not. So yeah, they did consider bringing Node time in, and it just wasn't worth the engineering effort to move the code base. I think the time to be honest, the time to really address times and dates would have been with a even less compatible than it was .NET Core 1.0, which probably would have not been great either, but it would have been the best time. Time zone conversion APIs. All right, so I'm sure there's a lot of people out here who are multi-platform, who are really annoyed that Windows has these weird strings like E.AUS Eastern Time or something, and there's another one that's just E.Australian Eastern Time, and you need to know one's Sydney and one's Queensland, and those are the IDs. And when you're on Windows, you need to use those IDs, and when you're on a Mac, you need to use something like Australia/Brisbane as the time zone identifier. Well, in .NET 6, it will actually do the conversion for you if you're trying to find the time zone by ID. So it'll go, hey, I couldn't find that time zone. Wait, what if they used the IANA time zone, or instead of the Windows one? Or what if they used the Windows one instead of the IANA one, which is the more likely case, to be honest. And they also fixed up time zone display names on Linux and Mac OS. So .NET is cross-platform. So yeah. We also got ASP.NET Core 6. Now there was some hot reload in .NET 5, but they really made improvements in .NET 6. So you can hit F5 and you can tweak your MVC view or something, and all of a sudden it'll just change in your browser without you losing all your state, without you losing all your field inputs. That's how it's meant to work. I honestly haven't tried it all that much because normally I've got some JavaScript stuff in the front end, but hot reload is a thing. Minimal APIs. You might see a bit of pushback on this around the place. I have, but it's basically a way of doing like ASP.NET web APIs in a form that will make people who pine for the days of Nancy happy. You can basically put a string with a route definition and then start a function. Minimal APIs have actually led to a whole heap of improvements for functions with regards to inferring the type that's coming back from a function and that sort of thing as well. So that's pretty cool. You've got some CSS isolation for pages and views that actually got pulled in from Blazor. So Blazor, obviously, you have components, and those of you who've programmed in Angular will know you have your HTML template, you have your code template, and you have your CSS template. And the CSS automatically gets scoped so that if you make the button red on that component, you don't make the buttons red everywhere. I don't know. I feel like sometimes that leads to a lot of duplication of CSS. I'm still a bit backwards and forwards on it, but you can now do it for that Razor page or Razor view that you're doing. You can have CSS just for that. And JavaScript modules, same concept, but JavaScript. Just scope to that page. It's cool. And they've got some, the templates have been revamped to work with Angular 12, React 17, and other JavaScript frameworks. So that's pretty cool. All right. So I'm coming up really close. So what if we hadn't had a 2-year break around this time of year, only a couple of months ago? What might I have talked about? Well, there's .NET Framework. A whole heap of .NET Framework is no longer supported as of April 26, 2022. So if you're still got apps out there on 4.6.1, sorry, all those other versions up there, no longer supported. .NET Framework, that's not the last of .NET Framework. There's a lot more out there. So 4.6.2, 4.7, 4.7.1, 4.7.2, 4.8. they're all still supported. But I think slowly it's going to be whittled down to 4.8. So you should really, if you're going to upgrade, head towards there. But there's, probably over the last year, 18 months, Microsoft's been doing a bit more to help people who are on .NET Framework move across to .NET Core in an easier way than let's just rebuild this application from the start, which is kind of where you were. So what might you be able to do to migrate from .NET Framework to .NET 6? Well, about a year ago, Microsoft released the Upgrade Assistant. It's a .NET tool. So from your command line, you can go .NET tool install and install it. It converts a whole heap of different app types. It converts ASP.NET MVC, console apps, class libraries, Windows Forms, WPF, native UWP. And it's like a multi-step process. It's essentially a wizard. It's all done in your console there. So it's got a mixture of scripts and Roslyn code fixes, and it goes through a set process. So it does some analysis of your solution. It asks you to pick where's your entry point that you'd like to convert. So if you're converting a web app, that would be your ASP.NET Core, or sorry, not Core yet, ASP.NET app. And what it will do is it will go through and it will do the conversions to convert that through to a .NET Core. Kinda. So it's not foolproof. You can't just point it at absolutely anything, click next, 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 and go away. There's some things that it doesn't really handle very well. The big one is WCF. Now, a lot of things are sitting on .NET Framework, and the reason they're still sitting on .NET Framework is WCF. Let's be honest. Yeah, you've got to have a SOAP service for that enterprise integration. So what can we do about WCF? Well, we can have a community project called Core WCF that re-implements WCF, but in open source. So Microsoft decided that the only part of WCF they were going to port to .NET Core was the client. So you can write .NET Core that connects to WCF-based services easily using out-of-the-box tools. But what you can't do is create a new service. There's no file new WCF project template. I'm sure there's a few people in the room who are like, good. But it doesn't help those of us who still have WCF services in their projects. So it's a community project. I believe they did get a kickstart by being licensed to start from some code that Microsoft was allowed to release open source. This is the 1.0 release. They think it's ready to start going into production. This actually has some Microsoft support. So Microsoft's gone, yeah, okay, I'll realize. So you can actually contact Microsoft product support with Core WCF in your app, and they will help you with Core WCF. You have to be on a supported .NET version of .NET Core, or .NET Framework 4.8 with a specific version of ASP.NET Core 2.1 that is still supported. There's a magic version there, which incidentally is a good tip if you're moving something old and trying to go forward. ASP.NET Core 2.1, believe it or not, that's a good stepping stone to get you out of Framework. But yes, it runs on Net Standard too, so it will run on Framework as well. So you can migrate your service while it's all running on Framework, make sure everything's working, and then you can do the .NET Core porty bit. But maybe that's not even. I've started talking about incremental migrations there, and this is incremental migration for the WCF portion. It's still going to have to be all in one go for the WCF portion. And if your app is mostly WCF services, that's not much comfort. So, hot off the presses, only in Preview 2. Preview 1 was out about a month and a half ago. This is incremental ASP.NET migration. So let me explain what's going on here. So it allows you to do a piece-by-piece migration. So what you do is you install an extension into Visual Studio called the Migration Assistant, and you say, I'd like to migrate this ASP.NET MVC5 Web API 2 project. It'll create you a new project next to it, a .NET Core project. It will install YARP, Y-A-R-P. Anyone heard of YARP before? Yeah. YARP. So YARP is a reverse proxy built by the .NET ASP.NET Core team, and the idea is that it basically just takes requests and throws them out to another service, and then takes a response and throws it back to the first service. So that's what's happening in the middle here. So you initially, all you need to do is install the extension to VS, right-click Upgrade Project on your ASP.NET application. It'll create this ASP.NET Core application and set up a whole heap of references. You can install into your business logic. Your business logic might be reaching in to HTTP context, HTTP context.current. That won't work in the ASP.NET Core side. So if you want to use that business logic from the ASP.NET Core, they've got some helper libraries for the system web components that'll help you do that. Make a couple of other tweaks. It's still not completely smooth, but fire it up. You host the ASP.NET Core project, and you point all your clients at it. And it starts getting requests. It doesn't know what to do with any of them. It doesn't have any controllers or API controllers or anything. So it ends up falling through the routing to YARP. And YARP is pointed at your old ASP.NET on full framework project. And so it sends the request over there. So what you can do now is you can implement one controller, and suddenly your ASP.NET Core app knows how to handle that route. So the routing won't fall to YARP, and you'll handle it in your app. And your users are none the wiser. They're just sending requests and they're getting responses. It's great. Then you implement that second controller and you test it. Now, maybe you don't go to production in this state. Maybe you wait until the ASP.NET Core is fully built. But what it would allow you to do is it allow you to stay operating in test environments so that you can validate your work piece by piece. Because there's nothing worse than sitting down and going, all right, the next 6 months, nothing's going to work. And then we're going to test it. And if we've done everything right for 6 whole months, success. That's no good. You need to be able to port that one action and say, yeah, I can get a list of widgets using my .NET Core. Great, cool. Move on to the next bit. So yeah, this is in preview 2. So obviously it's still early days, but it does allow you to do that incremental migration. So you don't have to boil the whole ocean. You don't have to chew it all in one bite. You can just take little nibbles. All right. So let's do a little bit more time travel. We're starting to go into the future. That date seems to be taken. Rahul, I might leave it to you to do your talk in a month's time. Is that okay? All right. We'll all just have to come back. If you want to know what's in Rahul's talk, sorry, that's a bit embarrassing, bit of a misconfiguration of the time machine there. Let's go forward another month after that. Now, I probably won't be talking, mostly because, Todd's not going to have me back so soon. But if I was coming back, I might be looking forward to .NET 7, because that's just around the corner. Yes, November is not too far away, and it certainly won't be in 2 months' time. So what are we going to be seeing in .NET 7? Well, .NET 7 is going to be one of those current releases. So you see this even odd, long-term is even, odd releases are odd, current releases. So it'll be supported like .NET 5 was for about 18 months. So if you move to .NET 7, you'll need to move to .NET 8 in about a year's time and plan for it. Normally the upgrades are pretty easy, but that depends on your app. Improved host error messages. This one I thought was really good because they're going to actually put a whole heap of time into, or have put a whole heap of time into making the error messages actually helpful if you don't have the right version of the framework installed. It'll even give you a, hey, would you like to download it now and install it button. So I thought that was pretty cool, especially if those of you out there are managing, I don't know, deploying apps onto desktops or something like that. You're going to hit this. Oops. I shouldn't have gone forward. I have more to say on that slide. Obviously.
The host error messages are dreadful at the moment, though, right? Like you can get the most useless error message you've ever seen. It's just because you're running on the wrong version of .NET. You think they could just tell you, but they just give you something with HTTP error code.
Yeah.
It's completely, it's terrible.
Yeah, and it explains in plain English what the problem was. And it gives you a link where you can get even more plain English about what the problem was. Okay. How do I jump? There's Rahul's face. No, there we go. There we go. All right. Very quickly. Improvements to assembly trimming. Remember we were talking about Blazor running in the browser. Some of you may be thinking, holy crap, we've got to download about 100 meg of .NET. No, you don't have to do that. But also over .NET 6 and .NET 7, they've been doing assembly trimming, which is basically cutting out the bits that you're not going to use. Now, the tricky part is working out which bits those are, because if you get it wrong, of course, stuff breaks. But they've been getting better with that, and there's some Roslyn analyzers that'll actually help you annotate your code to tell the compiler which bits of code you might use and which you might not. Templating improvements. I'm talking about .NET New. .NET New templates. If you're running on Windows, you're probably not going to want a .NET New, a Linux app, because you're not going to be able to run it. So those templates will be able to have restrictions on them. And there's going to be some APIs for implementing rate limiting. So I'm sure there's some people in the audience who know a lot more about the theories of rate limiting. But I thought these were really interesting. About it's the code I saw was very similar to getting semaphores and that sort of thing. You can have only a certain number of users at a time can pass through here, or a certain number of users with a particular key can pass through here at a time, all supported by the APIs. Some new cool stuff in C# 11. This is great. So you can get generic attributes. So you see here we've got my attribute, which expects some type that the attribute works on. You can now do my attribute and the angle brackets like a generic. So that's cool. That's just passing types in. Raw string literals. Have you ever had a string in your source code that would be so much easier to read if you could just use your double quotes in it and not escape them? And perhaps you wanted to, I don't know, have a chunk of JSON in the middle of your code that you could just string interpolate into, but it's got all those curly braces. So that's terrible, isn't it? Raw string literals come to the rescue. You can put 3 or more opening quotes, and after that, you need the same number of quotes to close the string. Anything less than that will simply be a quote, or be those quotes, literally. And if you can also put a number of $signs at the front. $2 means it takes 2 curly braces in a row to open up a hole for string templating. So that's pretty cool for people who like to put large blobs of strings into your C# files. I see a few faces with pained expressions. Sorry, people are going to do that. Extended name of scope. So if instead of type of, you were passing name of in there, and that was the name of one of the parameters, that wouldn't work right now, because the parameters of the method are only in scope in the method, not in the attributes before the method, until C#11. So that's really cool. Really handy for nullability. So nullable reference types, you can put attributes on to describe when various things are going to be null. This is very handy for that. And list patterns. So I only really just saw this when I was researching this talk, but I think these are going to be really cool. Imagine you had a CSV that you would split up into an enumerable of arrays, each array being one row, and you wanted to check that you got a 1 in the first position, anything in the second position, a number greater than 2 in the third position, some other junk that you don't care about, and then you wanted anything that matched that row, you wanted to put the value of the last item into the var called last item. That's what that does. So you can say, if that happens, process the last item. So think a switch statement where you're processing a bank balance and you want to do one thing with withdrawals, one thing with deposits, one thing with fees. Awesome. That's going to be really cool. And yeah, hopefully what you've done is you've seen something that's really cool for you in all that stuff. Now, I know that was a lot of stuff and there wasn't a lot of code, but yeah, that's a summary of 2 years of .NET development. As seen through my eyes, I'm sure that if you did as much trawling through the dev blogs on Microsoft, you'd have pick out some different things that were of interest. If you've got some spare time, yeah, you might discover something interesting and get excited about .NET. So thank you very much for listening.
Do we have any questions for Adrian about 2 years of .NET development? No?
Has anyone got projects on .NET 6 and are happily living in the future? Oh, yeah. Who's still on .NET Framework and are just jealous of everyone who put their hands up?
There's multi-targeting.
Yeah, there's multi-targeting, so you can if-def your way to the fun stuff. No, that's cool.